Hello, we're here tonight with David DuByne, aka Adapt 2030. He's here tonight at Disclosed TV to discuss mini ice age slash global cooling and a plethora of other items. So let's get to it. David?
Okay, Retro 77. I see you're talking about chemtrails. It's also called stratospheric aerosol geoengineering. That's the actual real scientific term for it. Chemtrails put you right into that conspiracy trigger word. Turn off immediately when you hear chemtrails. That is the word that they've chosen to turn you off. There's different trigger words. So conspiracy is a trigger word. Chemtrails is a trigger word. Illuminati is a trigger word. As soon as you hear those, you're programmed to turn off. At least most of the general population is. There's many layers to the onion on this one. So the stratospheric aerosol geoengineering, the secondary purpose or even the main purpose would be cosmic radiation management, meaning that those increased cosmic rays that are starting to bombard the planet and add in extra cloud cover, by putting all those metals in the atmosphere, they're trying to mitigate the actual, because when those particles hit that micro piece of metal, whether it be a barium, aluminum, strontium, when those particles hit that, they're instantly nullified. So the effect of the cosmic rays is diminished as it hits a piece of metal in the sky, if you will. Cosmic radiation management, 2 ice flows. He talks about this quite a bit. I think he had a 3-part series out there called Morpheus. You'll have to look. That's TWOICEFLOES.
Okay, with that, we'll get to our first question from the forums, and it comes from Iron Man, and he writes, I would like to know what he thinks is the reason why the MSM and science community are touting the CO2 crap as a cause for global climate change.
Well, that's a great question. You know why? Because there needed to be an answer in play as to why all the climate changes were happening. They couldn't let the public go in without some answer as to why it was changing, because the powers that be know it's changing. They knew it would change, and there had to be a plausible explanation for the change because everybody across the planet has seen changes. It's always on the news. They just had the first ever recorded F2 tornado up in, I think it was Illinois, the earliest one ever recorded. You know, when you start to get snows in the deserts of Saudi Arabia, snows across United Arab Emirates, people are noticing and waking up that there's, 3 feet of hail dumping on the equator in Ecuador. So they had to have some sort of explanation for people when the climate did start to change. So the most plausible thing is, hey, it was CO2. We're responsible for it. They can try to draw taxes off it. They can divide everybody because it's become a religion. So either you believe or you don't believe it. All the while, behind the scenes, they know what's happening and they're trying to prepare. Why do you think the world's become such a police state? Things are in play, so when it does get nasty, when the food riots come, they already have everything in place to try to mitigate the actual situation that's going on. And I really believe that's the reason that we were touted for CO2. You know, Gore, that whole thing with the lost election with Bush, everybody, he got so much sympathy for that, that when he became the CO2 czar, everybody just instantly believed him because they thought he was robbed of the election and they thought he was cheated. So that was a psyop in itself to try to get everybody on Gore's side. Like, oh, poor Gore. Yeah, we must believe him. He's the one who's telling the truth. He lost the election. Now he's telling us about CO2. Oh, he's such a great man. Wow, he's warning the planet. But all the while, this was a plan. It wasn't an actual election. He was meant to lose to get the sympathy to start the CO2 movement. And you can just see the play unfolding before your eyes now. And this whole divide and conquer of you either believe in CO2 warming or you don't has just divided our planet across the way. So when you try to present new information, you're met with skepticism, or people turn off, or, it's like a religion. You don't believe what I believe, you're a bad person, you're a good person, whatever it is. So many labels that go along with it. Shaggy?
This question comes from Darkheart, and he writes, This is a bit out there, but has he read Whitley Strieber's The Key, the subject of which is an encounter with a strange man who turned up at his hotel room in the middle of the night to explain how the northern hemisphere was going to enter an ice age that would effectively wipe out the developed countries. He said it would start like a bit of a bad winter, but then get worse and worse, until nothing worked and people would just freeze or starve. The film, Day After Tomorrow, was based on this. Does he, referring to you, think it could happen that fast, that everyone gets trapped by grounding planes and blocked roads and rail networks?
Well, if you go to iceagenow.info, if you look at the second post down currently, that's exactly what happened in Chicago the day before yesterday. People driving got trapped in blizzards. They just had to abandon their cars, and the fire department had to come in and try to rescue people out of their cars as they were driving. This is on main freeways around Chicago, Illinois, and it's happening right now. If you look back through history, these climate change abrupt drops in temperature can happen as quickly as 6 months to a year. The 1640s modern minimum, one summer it was a normal summer where they could get some crops, and then the very next summer it was 6 degrees Celsius cooler during the winter, and then it would undulate. But there's incredible temperature drops. If you look back through history at the climatic record going back to the Younger Dryas about 11,800 years ago, you can see there's abrupt climate change. There's abrupt drops in temperature. And off full ice ages and full glaciation, they had 10 degrees Celsius drops in as little as a single year. So could it happen? Would it, day after tomorrow, freeze people in their cars? Globally, across the entire northern hemisphere? Within a year, yes. We saw a very specific instance of it around Chicago the last couple days, so anything's possible. I didn't live 11,800 years ago during the Younger Dryas to experience the gigantic 11C drop at that time, but that was Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock who've come out talking about it was a meteor impact that put so much steam and water vapor into the atmosphere, and also gigantic floods along the west coast. That was the abrupt climate change, that it was sort of like a nuclear winter but caused by a comet that came through at that time. And after everything settled out of the atmosphere a couple hundred years later, it started to warm up just as quickly as the temperature dropped. So, is it out of the realm of possibility to consider that climate can change so instantly? Absolutely not. It's happened many times before. Could it happen again today just because we have TVs and cars and airplanes? Absolutely, it sure could. If the temperature does drop 1 to 2 C within a single year, the next following year there will not be very many crops available globally on the market, which would drive food prices to a point where nobody would want to sell it because they were waiting for the next price increase. And that's when we get into these food shortages. If I was a trader of wheat or corn, rice or soy, and I knew the price was going to rise next week, would I sell it to you? No. I would hold on to it to try to get as much money as I could. And that's the way these traders work. They don't care about you. They care about making money. So would they hold off selling 1 million tons of something because they know next week it'll be $8 more per bushel, $3 more per bushel, 50 cents more per bushel? Of course they'll wait. They won't sell it. And this is just going to exacerbate all of the food shortages. Shaggy?
Okay, this question comes from Kerbler. I live in Maui, Hawaii, where it is more or less subtropical climate. Past couple of years we have seen some massive switches in weather patterns. If you predict a possible global cooling, do you think it is Earth readjusting herself because of the damage we have done since the use of fossil fuels? And why do you think this is causing unrest with our governments? Think they know as well? If we are entering a global cooling, why are the ice, many bears, and other life in the Antarctic that depend on the ice for survival dying off?
I would like to start with the polar bears first, if I could, and then we'll reverse and go back to the swings in the jet stream. That's caused by a pressure differential. Again, when the solar winds are diminished, then there's a pressure differential between the equatorial bands, the mid-latitudes, and the Arctic that circulate the air. But let's start with the polar bears. I did a video on this one. It was polar bears and the snow leopards, pawns of the IPCC. That was a previous video that I did. Now, if you go into Ice Canada, or Canadian Ice Service, they do a full wrap-up of the polar bear populations in the Northern Hemisphere around the Arctic Circle. Now, on the Russian side, of the entire range of the polar bear, only 50% of it has actually been mapped and known, mainly around Canada, into, say, Alaska and around that area. The other Eurasian side, there's very little studies done. They don't even know the true population over there. It comes out as a whole brown area where it's unstudied, shall we say. But if we go back to the 1970s, there were 5,000 polar bears. Today, there's nearly 25,000 polar bears. So again, when you start to take a look at these bits of information given to us to continue the CO2 agenda, and anything that I just told you, please look up. Look up increases in polar bears, go to the Canadian Ice Service, there's full PDFs on the increases, compare that to the 1970s, and you'll start to take a look that something's not right what they're telling you. This year also is like the 7th year of the least amount of ice. So we go back to 2006, that's when there was the least amount of ice, followed by 2012, but then it's been recovering since. So there's actually more ice now by millions of square kilometers than there was in either 2006 or 2012, which means that there's more space for the polar bears, and there's more ice for them to frolic and do what they do. Now, going back to the changes on Maui, specifically with the trade winds, so the solar wind causes pressure on our planet. The particles coming off of the sun have a pressure with the solar wind speed. Usually it's around 500 kilometers, but it's recently been down into 300s, 200s. In this grand solar minimum, when it comes down to actually barely any solar wind, that means there's very little pressure against our magnetosphere. And the more wind there is, the more compression there is, so it keeps our weather patterns locked into a certain flow. When the solar wind decreases, the magnetosphere decreases, which allows clouds to undulate in different areas. And the pressure differential, there's 3 bands of clouds. One starts around the equator and rolls up to around 30 degrees north, if you will. It's like a conveyor belt that just works in that single area from the equator up to about 30 north. And then there's another band of clouds that takes over and circulates air from 30 north to about 60 north. And then there's a final band that goes from 60 to 90. Now, all 3 work in congruence as kind of a cogs in a wheel, if you will. Cogs in a machine that one rotates into the next, and it flows in the next, and then it pulls air. And we had stable patterns for all these years that I can remember growing up as a child until recently, because the decreased magnetosphere, the decreased solar winds, is allowing these what were tight bands of circulation in the atmosphere to start mixing and going into different latitudes that they're not normally going into, which breaks down the flow. There should be some kind of blocking high pressure ridges that are normally in place, but those have been kind of moved out of the way, and that's why you see these giant dips in the polar vortex coming all the way down to places like Florida, dipping in way down to the Middle East, down into Saudi Arabia. And the polar vortex that rolled through here last dumped snow in Vietnam 300 kilometers south of Hanoi, the first time they ever had snow there, and it was 30 centimeters. Now, it wasn't a dusting. This was the first time they ever recorded snow 300 kilometers south of Hanoi, and they got a foot. It wasn't a dusting. So, you start to see these giant undulations in the jet stream, all attributed to the solar wind. And going from this point forward, it's just going to get wilder. The weather's going to get crazier. And this is all effects. And you would expect the weather to be marked by extremes as we enter this new mini ice age. Mega droughts, mega snowstorms, tornadoes and waterspouts in unusual locations at unusual times of the year, hurricanes and typhoons forming in different parts of the ocean that are not normal, and also in different times of the year. And I hope that answers your question, Shaggy.
Okay, this next question comes from Evil Dweeb. I understand the whole ice thingy, but no one can seem to nail down the causative factors and the intermittency and the results we are getting. You, David, I would ask that there is a relationship between the solar activity by Ben Davidson and the activity here on Earth, which can be then in some way coincidental connection behind between sunspots and what he calls weather spots, and does.
Absolutely, yes. Kong-Pop Uyen and Ben Davidson released peer-reviewed studies that were peer-reviewed. They're even putting out a new emergency app that's on Kickstarter right now. Kong-Pop and Ben are working together to have a disaster mitigation app that links the solar vortices that have effects on our Earth. Now you'll notice where there's a lot of typhoons and hurricanes, you'll have earthquakes directly under that. That's all electromagnetic in nature. And they feel with the solar forecasting that they can actually predict where on this planet connected to the sun that there will be some sort of disaster occurring, that at least with the solar stream they can predict it efficiently enough for them to come out with this peer-reviewed study showing the direct connection. Shaggy?
This question comes from Fat Dog. If we are entering a mini ice age, why are temperatures reaching new global highs continuously on an annual basis?
That's not everywhere. And also, are they measuring ground temperatures or are they measuring lower troposphere temperatures? And if we start measuring lower troposphere temperatures, those are dropping and have a continual downward trend and have been for over 20 years. If we go to global surface temperatures, that varies mile to mile, and you cannot tell me that we have hundreds of millions of temperature stations. And also the fraud that NOAA has been caught outright with adjusting temperatures, manipulating data, moving the temperature stations into heat island areas near air conditioning, exhausts, vents, putting it in the center of parking lots, moving it next to airport runways in the takeoff lanes, as well as most of these readings are coming from the center of the ocean. Now, how can you possibly give a reading for the entire surface of the planet's oceans when you look at these charts that are coming out? It's hard enough to measure temperature on a land-based area, let alone just using pure satellite data, because if you go into the 3 different satellite feeds, RSS, UAH, they all come up, they're varying as well. There's variances within the satellite temperature data. So if it was such a precise science, the satellites should all be getting the same data, but they're not. They're off by degrees of magnitude in difference. So to come up with a global picture of, oh, it's warming everywhere, that is incorrect. And there's not temperature stations to measure the oceans in every single square kilometer or square mile, or even a 10 square kilometer or even a 100 square kilometer mile radius. The middle of the Pacific Ocean, there's not anything out there to measure temperature. They're trying to use satellites and reconstruct the data and say, hey, it warmed like this. With all the temperature manipulation going on through NOAA, of course they're going to put something. There's no people out there to verify if it's colder or warmer. They just say, hey, it's hotter here. Well, prove it to me. There's no buoys out there measuring temperature. Satellites going over the planet can only measure a small fraction of any part of our planet at any one time. There's no way to continuously monitor every surface square inch of our planet by satellites 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When they go around, they take a small swath and then they reconstruct the temperature based on that. So this continuously warmest year ever, I know a lot of places where it's the coldest year ever. Hundreds of them. Breaking temperature records going back to the 1850s, 1870s, 1890s. There's a lot of cold out there. Again, this continuation of the global warming agenda. A, to try to get you to pay a global consumption tax, and B, to keep you off guard and not prepare, because they don't want you to take your money out of the bank and they don't want you to quit your job because that will disrupt the economic system. Shaggy?
This question comes from Hertz. To adapt. The question: there are several HAARP installations in operation around the planet. Do you feel that they can affect the weather? Besides the other data you present, Could you also explain some of the odd weather patterns we have been seeing?
That I don't have information on. I have talked to a few other people who say that if it would be an extremely localized area. But again, I just don't have any data. I know the HAARP facility in Alaska has been turned over to the university. It's no longer under government control. And you can actually rent out the HAARP facility to do different experiments on your own if you have the credentials and the money to rent the facility. And again, it's not under government control anymore. They've moved on, and the U.S. government has built a different facility that is not the same one that you're so familiar with, where you see that array of antenna. That is now privatized for rent through a University of Alaska, and you can do your own experiments up there. But otherwise, about heating the ionosphere and doing different things to bend clouds and separate layers in the troposphere, I don't have any information on that, and I won't comment on that.
Well, luckily Hertz has another question here, so let's get to it. To adapt 2030. Question. Chemtrails have been at the top of the conspiracy theory followers list for a long time, and independent testing over the past decade confirms that chemtrails around the country contain a dangerous and extremely poisonous mix of chemicals that includes barium, nano-aluminum-coated fiberglass, known as chaff, radioactive thorium, cadmium, chromium, nickel, desiccated blood, and mold spores, etc.
Yeah, I sure could. I've seen a few of the patents that are rolling about that have put those into a nano-sized particulate to be dispersed in the atmosphere. Again, it comes back to the cosmic radiation management. But when that stuff does descend down to the ground, what does it do to the soils? And Dane Wigington, he does a great job because he lived up in the Pacific Northwest and saw the environment around him being affected so much by whatever was falling with the aluminum levels around their area, where he measured, lake water or pond water right around his house, and it was something like 10,000 times over baseline for aluminum levels. As well, aluminum, it's an accelerant in fires, so why are forest fires so much more intense? And a lot of the new patents that are coming out, if you look into the new Monsanto patent, there's actually a new patent for aluminum resistance in soils, which is a shocking one because that seems to be one of the main constituents of the mix. Now, the end purpose of it, I don't know, but the mitigation measures for cosmic radiation from the cosmic rays coming in because of the decreased magnetosphere and the effects from our sun in a decreased state, I don't know where to go with that. I don't know what the end ploy is. What are the seed banks for? Are they trying to preserve the original seed stock and the original genetic code of our seeds on the planet? I mean, there's a lot of Syngenta, Monsanto coming out with different seed applications, growing in different types of soils that are contaminated by metals, as well as there's a bunch of patents coming out for cold weather varieties and stress-resistant crops for either drought or cold or wet. So what do they know that we don't know? That they're actually creating all these new strains of plants to resist the exact same things of all the effects that are being talked about during a grand solar minimum. Extreme dryness in some areas, extreme droughts. You're going to see droughts in the 500-year range, followed by extreme snowstorms. It'll be a 300-year snowstorm 6 months later after a 500-year drought in the exact same location. So it just makes you wonder, all these new patents for the seeds, why are they really being out there put into the public sphere? And what are they preparing for that we are not being told? Shaggy?
Okay, this next question is a bit long, so bear with me. This one's from Minion. Hi David, do you think that maybe we look in the wrong direction when trying to understand climate change? If you study the sun, you can often find the effect, not always the cause of it. Maybe we should be looking in the other direction at the factors which drive the solar cycle and look for changes to that instead. Solar output, as it is understood, being associated with climate conditions by many who do not consider other effects. Change in the potential of the intergalactic field can have a greater influence on climate. The planets in their orbits are able to affect, through small signals, enormous changes in our solar field. The outer gas giants even more so. The solar cycle may well be driven by the orbit of Jupiter, and sun events may be offset, or indeed dampened by conjunctions which occur between Jupiter and Saturn, and also affected by Neptune and Uranus, but in a longer time frame. So my question comes down to the cause and effect, really. Do you think we look in the wrong place to predict future weather? Would we not be better informed if we study the orbits of the outer planets and look for their effect on the solar field?
Yes, because we live in an electric universe. Our sun is an externally powered star, which is connected to other solar systems and other star systems, which are connected further on. From the center of our galactic core, there's electromagnetic resonance coming out in a torus field. One star system connected to the next. It's been shown through at least the last 500,000 years on our planet that there's a direct wave, if you will, of undulation in the electromagnetic spectrum. If you look at the long-term history of cycles of climate change, it looks like a heartbeat, if you will, when you look at the up and down in the regular pattern, kind of like an EKG for our own heart. Sometimes the beat's a little stronger, sometimes it's about a half beat, a quarter beat, but then it repeats the pattern again. Now perhaps referring to some external binary star orbital body, Sumerian myths talk about this. Would it return during our time? Not sure. I don't have any comment on that. But the Jovian planets, the gas giants in the outer solar system, if you look at Theodore Landscheidt's work, you'll see that when these gas giants all align on one side of the sun with the Earth on the same side, that there's perturbations in the orbits that cause significant effects on our Earth. He's mapped it out into 8 different variables of effects based on which quadrant the lineup starts, the effects of which planet pair pass in front of which pair, if it's Saturn-Jupiter lined up, or if it's Uranus-Neptune lined up, or if it's any combination of those 4, there's going to be a leading pair of planets, and there'll be a trailing pair followed 10 years later. Currently, it looks like we're repeating something from 79 AD, almost down to the exact within 1 or 2 degrees arc of the sky of what happened in 79 AD, or the second closest one would be something around 1860. 1645 matches up as a third possibility, but when we go back to around 740 AD, there's also another matchup that would be the 4th best. But whatever's coming down the pike right now, if it is matching with 79 AD, and we can also find an almost exact match going back, but you need to go to, I think it was 439 or 438 BC, you'll start to see that 400-year pattern repeating itself, but you're looking at the lineup of the planets and the Jovians on the outside there. Yeah, there's definitely some electromagnetics coming through our cosmos that affect the actual output of the stars, and you can see it in a pattern, and I just see the pattern lining up with something in the 400-year cycle. You can do your own research on it. Use Solar System Scope. That is a free software. You can just go to the website, Solar System Scope. You can program in any dates that you want. It's got some nice graphics and visuals, so you can really see it. That's different from the JPL model, which is basically dots with the name on it of the planet. I like it a little more visually, where you can actually see the colors and you can see where their orbits are. And basically, those pairs of planets put the Earth in a sandwich. So when you start to see the Earth between the 2 pairs, the leading pair and the following pair, when the Earth's in the center of that, with the sun on the backside, all the Jovians, and us between the sun and the Jovians all lined up on the same quadrant, that's when we start to get these effects, and we're rolling right back in. The turnover point for this particular rotation should be around 2019, when the Earth swings across coming around into that same sandwich position. As we get into 2023, we get into that magical point where everything's in perfect alignment. 2023 is going to be the intensification point, and that will be the start of the extreme cold for about 3 to 5 years. And after the second planet pair rotates around 10 years after, it should start to warm up again around 2035. Hence the name of my channel. It seems there's a lot of dissuasion of you even looking at this. So you can make your own judgment. I encourage you to go do the planetary rotations yourself, look to see what you can find, come up with your own conclusions, and if you find something new, please share it with me. I'd love to hear what you find. Shaggy?
Okay, now this is one of the last questions I have from the forum, so it's from No Entry. Could the global cooling be a natural event, or is it certain? Elements within government have been modifying global weather. Your thoughts on that?
Comes back to that technology point again. Are we really at the point where we can modify entire global weather patterns? That I don't have an answer for, but I would absolutely say that in the natural cycle, you can see it again and again and again. If you just go into Google and put 3,000 year global temperature reconstruction, you can see how there's been so many ups and downs in a natural cycle long before factories, long before SUVs, long before coal burning, long before the 1750s. The temperature just naturally undulates. Now that comet impact 11,800 years ago in the Younger Dryas, which hit over North America, and that's why there's very few large animal species. But if you go over to Africa, you'll find a lot of larger animal species, because that cometary impact on the glacier at that time, 2 miles thick, and you got a meteor slamming into that. You know, the greatest effects were right here, and they had, 800,000 foot walls of water off the instant melt come through for 2 to 3 weeks through the Pacific Northwest, and you'll start to see these giant chasms, cascades, etc., that just don't make any sense. 4 times the height of Niagara Falls, rolling for 2 weeks from that impact. After that couple weeks, it started to freeze down again, and then the gradual melting came on after that. Natural cycles, yes. Man-made manipulation of the weather, I don't have any answer for that, because I don't know how high our technology is. And if they could do it, would a tiny fraction of something in a cloud pattern be bent to affect something further on? Again, I just don't know, but I will verify, and I will say yes, natural cycles, but man-made bending of our weather, I can't comment on that. Shaggy?
One thing I'd like you to go into a little bit and give us a little insight in is ocean's oscillation. I believe it's AMO and PDO. If you could touch a little bit on that, I'd want to get that in, make sure we get some of that information out to people.
Okay, so I don't know what everybody knows about ocean modulation and temperatures globally. So we'll dive into the 2 oceans. There's actually 3. We got the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the Indian Ocean measurements are called the Indian dipole. The Pacific is called the Pacific multidecadal oscillation. It's the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation and the Pacific decadal oscillation, the PDO. It's called AMO, that's multidecadal oscillation in the Atlantic, and the Indian dipole. If you go to woodfortrees.org, WOODFORTREES, woodfortrees.org, there's interactive graphs in there, and a lot of the videos, I'll go in and I'll make my own graphs for the particular video that I was doing on whether it be Atlantic, Pacific, or Indian Ocean cooling, warming. If you look at the temperature trend of HAAD-CRU, it matches pretty much with the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation. So it seems that the Atlantic drives the actual temperatures of the northern hemisphere. Now this undulates on a 30-year cycle. The Pacific also undulates on a 30-year cycle. Now normally these are offset. And then if we get into the Gleisberg cycles, which are on an 88-year cycle, And then we get into the solar minimums, which is on a 200 to 400 year cycle. Now you have these four variables. Now generally they're offset, where one will be going warm, like the AMO will be going warm and the PDO will go cold, and then there's no solar cycle happening for a grand solar minimum. So the effects are, they're spread out and they're sort of even. There's a regulatory kind of effect on the planet. So when you start to, let's measure them all. We'll say like number 1 is the AMO, number 2 is the PDO. The Gleisberg cycles are number 3. And we'll go with the solar cycles in a grand solar minimum as effect number 4. Now if 1's warm and 2's warm and 4 is warm, even if the Gleisberg cycle is off 3, it won't have any effect. Or if the Pacific's cold and the Atlantic's warm, again, there's a balance. But this particular cycle that's coming up, all 4 of those indicators are going cold at the same time. Also with the ENSO, ENSO, this is the Pacific area that they measure that La Nina or El Nino. There's 4 different areas. There's ENSO 1, ENSO 2. You can check those out. But what's interesting in this particular drop-off, it's been an extremely hot El Nino, but not the warmest El Nino ever. 97 was the warmest El Nino ever, 98. This one's second. So the drop-off from that El Nino in 1970s as well. When you get these extreme temperature events in the El Nino, they drop off and they go to La Nina. Now generally it takes about 6 to 8 months for this rollover to occur. But what is exceptional in this cycle is the rollover has occurred so fast that it's been more than a 1°C temperature drop in a single month in the Pacific Ocean belt where ENSO is measured. Now that is the most they've ever recorded in a drop-off in cooling since they've started this, and this was back in let's say 1889 or somewhere, where they started to get more reliable. Right around 1900, they actually had it pretty much down to a science, measuring the temperatures of, there was a lot more shipping traffic going back and forth then, so there were a lot more ships dragging thermometers behind and getting, readings, and a lot better log books, etc. But this time all 4 indicators are going cold, and the AMO is going cold. So generally, without everything else, when the AMO goes cold, it regulates the northern hemisphere temperatures, which shows a cooling trend just in itself, regardless of what's happening with the Gleisberg cycles, the solar cycles, or the PDO, or the Indian dipole. Indian dipole fluctuates so quickly, it's hot, it's cold, it's hot, it's cold, just in a year. So that one's not really a long-term indicator of cooling or warming. As such, the Pacific and the Atlantic are much more measurable on longer time frame cycles. So all 4 are going cold at the same time, which really indicates that there's going to be some severe rapid cooling. And with this La Nina that's going to take place, by the end of this year, we're going to flip into the La Nina. This next winter, hold on, because when this change comes, it is going to, the ocean temperatures drop about 4 degrees Celsius off this high temperature spike. We're going to drop down into the lower temperature spike, which is going to be 2 degrees below the 0 mark. This is going to have incredible effects across the planet in terms of rain, drought, and other severe storms that you've seen. This is going to be the first flip over year for extreme events coming up. I predict you're going to start to see a lot of stuff about crop losses with oranges, like we have in Florida this last week. A lot of losses in the oranges down there. But going forward, 2017, I think the first food shocks are going to start showing up around the winter of 2017 and 18 when they try to get that harvest in. They're going to realize that they're not going to be harvesting nearly as much, and that extra global food surplus for at least wheat, not going to be there. We're going to be running right at the baseline of any kind of surplus. But as we go forward into 2018-19, that's when that rollover year occurs with the Jovians and the outer planets, which is going to intensify the cold naturally. In 2018-19 is, I think, the first year where we're going to have significant crop losses, which is going to be below anything that they have in storage, which is going to drive our food 5 to 10 times higher price. At this point, people are going to wake up. This is why the police state has been set up, because all the people that cannot feed themselves, when they start looking for food and whatever assistance they get from the government to buy food doesn't cover their food costs anymore, What you saw happen across the planet in these riots that have been going on frequently in the last, say, year and a half or so is going to be small potatoes, because hungry people behave quite differently than politically driven people. When you're hungry and starving, it doesn't matter if you're looking down the barrel of a rifle. You're hungry and starving. And nothing's going to change unless you get food. So at that point, you're willing to die to get the food and do whatever you have to get the food. And if you look back in the 1640s and again in the 1860s, you're going to start to see what happens in the breakdown of society and how valuable food was. You know, they had to send armed convoys with the grain shipments because people would be trying to actually take over and pirate the grain shipments off the sides of the roads. Crime rate went up in just astronomical amounts, not just coming to steal your watch, but people actually breaking into homes searching for food. They left the valuables there. Well, what was considered valuables. They weren't stealing, watches and silverware and things of value at that time. They were in there stealing seeds, tools, and food. And that takes it to a whole new level when you're on the survival mechanism. And what if your neighbors come knocking at your door and they know you have food because you told them, hey, I'm a prepper? You're the first one everybody's coming for. And also, with the new laws passed in the United States by the government, and I think it was a month and a half ago, maybe it's been 2 months, it's right at the beginning of the year, they can prosecute you under hoarder laws and confiscate everything that you have because you're a hoarder and you're unbalancing the system. Even though you've been preparing all these years, they will consider you as being a hoarder, prosecute you, and take everything you have. Plus, the danger is all your neighbors know and you're going to be the first target on the block. So, I don't know where we're going with this, but Shaggy, back to you.
That's all good. We'll get back here. And I want to bring up volcanoes. The fact that there seems to be a rise in volcanic activity during solar minimums, which inject SO2 into the atmosphere. So I'm going to read something, bear with me again here, about volcanic eruptions and solar activity. This is quotes from Stuthers. Feedback on atmospheric from the two cycles is expected to come from enhanced sulfur loading of the stratosphere around the years of solar minimum, when the sun is least active. Volcanogenic aerosols should be present in the stratosphere in greater numbers, temporarily overwhelming the tiny aerosol background. At the same time, the sun's eccentric luminosity is slightly reduced below its mean value. Both of these external factors lower the amount of solar radiation absorbed by the stratosphere and thereby induce cooler worldwide average surface temperatures. I want to bring up the connection between the solar activity, climate, and volcano activity. Do you have any thoughts on that?
If you take a look globally right now, you'll start to see a lot of different volcanic areas that haven't shown any activity in 100, 200, 800 years that are starting to erupt right now. Now these are the above land volcanoes that we can accurately measure because there's cities around it and people can see the ash plumes and they can see the lava coming out. But what about all the underwater volcanoes? If there's this much activity above land, there's at least that much activity below water that we cannot see. Or if they do see it, it's very limited because the rover that would go down can only encounter one of them. And it is on a cycle. Every time we come into a grand solar minimum, you start to see at least one explosivity index around 7 per grand solar minimum. Something that would be a year without a summer on a large eruption. Let's go to the Arctic. Well, I'd like to talk about the Arctic for a moment. Even during the last maximum glaciation, the Wisconsin glaciation, we're talking there was 2 miles thick of ice over Wisconsin, that area up there that carved out the Great Lakes. During that time, the ice in the Arctic wasn't much more than it was today, unbelievably. And the reason I think that has been proven is that there's so much underwater volcanic activity with the warmer waters that it would have kept the ice at sort of an equilibrium. Now, just 2 months ago, you saw where there was a break through the ice off the Gackel Ridge. I think that's G-A-K-K-E-L, Gackel Ridge. That's the ridge of underwater volcanoes that's running through the center of the Arctic Circle. It's approximately the height of the Alps, the length of the Alps in Europe. But they actually had a breakthrough that you can see, a perfect hole from the satellites into the Arctic ice, because that was where the volcanic activity under the ice is so intense right now that it made an almost perfect circle from the meltwater coming up. Absolutely, there's going to be more volcanism. It's just a symptom, an effect of reduced solar winds and reduced magnetosphere pressure. There's a let up on the pressure on the crust. You're going to see more volcanoes, more large earthquakes, more tsunamis, and just different random effects like this. All that ash and particulate going up into the atmosphere, how many volcanoes can you really have erupting at a time that are putting microparticulates up there before it has, as well as the sulfur dioxide, before it has some reflective properties against the sun, as well as what's up in there with nanoparticulate metals? Now you're starting to get a double up of the effect. So how many more volcanoes need to go off? You know, some of those plumes are going 60,000 feet up, being captured by, you know, the jet stream and being pushed around the planet. Okay, it doesn't encircle the entire planet in a single day. Some of it will drop out, of course, regionally. 100 miles from where it's at, 50 miles from where it's at, 30 miles from where it's at. But those are regional effects locally on crop production, because when the ash falls out, it affects the plants. So how many regional areas can you have that are affected, that are in crop growing areas where volcanoes are going off? That's point number one. How much damage will there be from the actual ash fall onto the plants that they can't harvest? The fish farms, the cows that can't graze on grass that has been covered in volcanic dust, nor chickens, nor pigs, if you let them free range. Secondly, how many volcanoes need to go off and push plumes 60,000, 80,000 feet up before it encircles the planet and creates enough microparticulates that it does have reflective capabilities on the sun as well as the gases? How much underwater activity does it take to heat an ocean to cause more water vapor to get into the atmosphere, to cause more clouds along with the cosmic rays? Then you start getting into this whole feedback loop where it intensifies itself until the grand solar minimum eases. All the pressure from the magnetosphere gets put back on because the solar wind increases, and then all these clouds start to wring themselves out, if you will. The volcanoes decrease, which stops the aerosols, and then the earthquakes also decrease, and we come back into a period of stability for 200 to 400 years. We're going into this feedback loop right now, and it really has nothing to do with CO2. I mean, that is the excuse given because you're starting to see the changes. The CO2 is a result of the changes. It's not the cause. These electromagnetic forces. Now, once you know what you're looking for, you can start to predict everything. And that's all I do with my channel is I look back through history. A history book and following of solar cycles, and you can do what I do. You just need to dig into it. Once you know what you're looking for, you can start to find it. And it's nothing more than that. I read a lot of history books, and I like to see what happens. There's a few books out there, quite a few books actually. The Little Ice Age, that's a good one. It goes into the whole thing I was telling you about, the grain shipments, cannibalism at that time. People would catch each other and eat each other. People would eat their children. They would sell their children, kill their children for food. Just crazy stuff that you thought not possible. This is it. Reading The Little Ice Age, that book, The Little Ice Age, whoa, it's a wake-up call. Because if we repeat anything like that again, and remember, in the 1600s, people were much more hardy than we are. They knew how to grow their own food. They could repair their own homes. There was an unlimited supply of wood that they could burn. You know, but they had significant problems surviving during that time. Although they didn't have just-in-time delivery, which could also be an Achilles heel. If something breaks down further down the chain, you know, the supermarket doesn't get filled and the 3 days worth of food run out. Oh, and might I add a point to that? A lot of our just-in-time delivery relies on credit. And going into an economic crisis, if you will, will limit the availability of credit for a forward purchase. So food and grain producers, if they can't get letters of credit, who's going to be paying cash for that? And again, the shipping comes down to the same thing. What kind of terms are the shipping lines on? Are they 90 days, 60 days, or will they only take cash? Let's say you have 1 million tons of wheat that you just bought. Are you going to be able to ship it somewhere, or is the forwarder going to be trying to charge you cash as well? You need to pay out cash for 1 million tons of wheat. There's going to be a strain on the cash supply if there's no credit, and if there's no credit, nothing gets delivered because there's no credit, and nobody's going to take a chance on selling you something if they know they're not going to get paid back. So the more the economic crisis intensifies, the less credit there will be. And again, that's a whole feedback loop in the delivery system of the just-in-time delivery. So there's two sets of variables going on the planet. The delivery of the goods itself is a feedback loop set based on economic activity, which, if you looked at the Baltic Dry Shipping Index, is the lowest it's ever been in recorded history. So it means there's the least amount of economic activity occurring on the planet right now. And then we add in all these extra effects of droughts, extreme snowstorms, volcanic activity, cooling oceans, and a grand solar minimum. And these two are overlapping on top of each other as well. So there's a lot going on, and I just want this to be a truth platform. I want people to compare ideas. I love when people write in and they give food growing ideas or ideas how to be more sustainable on my comment board. I'll always try to push those to the top of my comment board to give others like you a chance to take a look at what others are talking about in the way to be more sustainable, whether it be different ways to grow potatoes earlier in the year, using fruit walls like they did in the 1700s, LED grow towers, whatever. If you talk to me about how to grow food more efficiently, I'm putting you to the top of my posts on my board. Shaggy?
Oh, I agree, David. It's helping others get prepared and sharing information. 100%. We're coming to an end here, so I want to thank Mr. David DuByne, aka ADAP 2030, coming into Disclosetv for a live chat session. We got a full hour in, and I want to thank him. I hope everybody got something from this. We're not trying to doom monger or anything like that. Just share information and data that some may not be aware of. So if you have any closing items that you'd like to speak of, please do.
Okay, I'll just finish up with one last comment here. This is an incredible time to be alive, and the reason I have my channel out there is, you're right, I don't want to come at this with a state of fear. If you know what's happening, you can easily prepare for it. You can inform others in your community about it. It's going to be about you working with other people. You're not going to be able to, stockpile food and live by yourself in a basement for 30 years waiting for this thing to pass over. Even during the grand solar minimum, there were some summers that had acceptable harvests that between the complete crop losses that occurred. During the 1640s and again during the 1850s and 60s, there was more money made and more business opportunities, and there were more millionaires created during those times because there were suddenly different niches and different needs to be fulfilled. Right now, I really believe there's going to be significant technology jumps during this time on food production. New inventions, new ways to grow food, more efficiency. It'll get us off this just-in-time delivery where people will have to take more accountability in their own communities, if you will. Working together, it's just going to reset. It's going to be a reset button for, a lot of the way that we live our lives. I think the online presence is going to have such a greater impact as well, because the traditional jobs of getting in your car and driving to work, that's going to be not as prevalent as it is today. And again, these jumps in technology and these different niches that need to be filled, there's a huge opportunity out there right now. And if you don't know what's coming, you're going to be panicked. Excuse me, but if you do know what's coming, you can definitely take steps to prepare for it. So when it does occur, you're snug and safe mentally, physically, spiritually. But if you're not prepared and you just don't know what's happening, you're going to be one of the people on the street. So you can either be a participant in the riots and the food shortages, or you can be a spectator because you prepared and try to also help other people prepare. That's the whole reason I'm doing what I'm doing. It's not a fear-monger thing. I want you to prepare. I want you to be prepared. I want you to survive. I want you to thrive actually during this time. In any way that you can prepare yourself. Because one day you're going to wake up on the news and there's been a gigantic cataclysmic stock crash. Your banks might be on a bank holiday. You can't get any cash out of the bank. And then you're going to think about, oh, maybe I should just grow my food to save some monies because the price of vegetables just quadrupled. Everything else that's been bought is 10 times higher price in the supermarket. Well, you go to the store, all the seeds are sold out, all the tools are gone, then what? They're not going to be redelivered because there will be no credit to redeliver it. So those of you who are trying to prepare right now, I applaud you. Please be the leaders of your community. Inform other people what's going on. Try to get others discussing the issue. You have about a couple years left. 2019, I really believe, is the rollover year where things, 17, 18 is going to be a wake-up call, but 18, 19 winter is going to be something that they won't even have record books for it. It's going to go so far back in history. Some of the older European areas do have records back to the 1600s with temperature and climate data. We'll be approaching and looking at those records as kind of a comparison to what the temperatures will be. Increasing glaciers, volcanic activity increases, just the whole gamut of things. But you already know what's going on, those of you listening, so you should be the leaders of your community, and I wish you the best of luck, and I hope you thrive and prosper and have a great time. And when you come out at the end of this thing, that you will be much more self-sufficient, you'll have a greater reconnection with the human species. Doesn't matter what color your skin is, black, white, purple, green, orange, whatever, it won't matter anymore. What religion you believe in, it won't matter because you're another human helping another human survive. And I really hope there's a reconnection of our species again, because the human race is so divided. You divide yourselves amongst how much money you make, and you're still living in the same communities. So I'm really hoping at the end of this, a really hopeful time, because all the ancient cultures and all the religions talk about a golden age occurring after some readjustment of society, and I think we're starting to enter this readjustment, and I really believe when we come out on the other end, wow, we're going to have a whole different look at the way we live, the people around us, and how valuable each individual person can be in a community effort, regardless of, again, your economic strata, your religious beliefs, your race. Just won't matter. We're all one human species, and I'm going to leave you with that thought, Shaggy.
All right, excellent. Adapt 2030, David DuByne, thank you very much for coming in Disclose TV. Everybody here again, check him out, subscribe and follow his information as he gets it out to us.